My name is Francesco Calderoni. I'm a professor of criminology at Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. I am and represent one of the partners of DIGIWHIST consortium. Welcome to this third session. We have a lot of exciting results to share with you, and we will do that in the first part of the session, where we will present the, let's say, three main outputs of our project. And this will be followed by comments by three well-respected guests that we gathered for this part. And of course, we'll have plenty of time for question and answers and comments from the floor. So I quickly pass the word to our first presenter. So we have Aram Khaghaghordyan, who is one of our colleagues and researchers that will present Europam, one of the, let's say, the first output of DIGIWHIST. Aram, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. When we started today, a couple of guests said that they are really having a problem and they need to have the experts when it comes to legislation. I think Frederick Lindenberg was saying that he has a hard time understanding all the thresholds, and Ana Gomez was saying how sometimes it's really difficult to understand this. So this was our problem when we started DIGIWHIST. If we want to compare 35 countries and we need to know the laws and understand what are the rules of the games in each country, we need to analyze these laws. And based on this, we try to create a portal where we will analyze accountability mechanisms and present it to the public in an easy way. So what is Europam? Europam is a database of legal and regulatory norms that produces assessment of in-law efforts to enhance the transparency of public administration and accountability of public officials. So we release it in both quantitative and qualitative form. We cover 34 countries plus the European Commission. And its goal is to empower civil society, investigative journalists, civil servants, businesses with the information and tools they need to increase transparency. So if you are a public official, you can help revise, update, and improve your legislation. As a researcher, you can analyze your own country, several, or across 35. As a journalist, you can have a quick overview of data already analyzed by lawyers instead of spending hours and hours trying to understand what the law does really say. And also businesses can have a really quick overview of data, both in there but also in neighboring countries, including things like thresholds, reporting requirements, etc. But we also look at this data and try to analyze and see if this legislation and the presence of it and more legislation and more rules, does this bring us somewhere? And what are these public accountability mechanisms good for and in what context? And our analysis shows that just legislation itself doesn't work, but it works only if it is coupled with other instruments and efforts. So freedom of information laws works when we have really active civil society, and conflict of interest legislation will be redundant if there are no not active press and there are journalists who are working on it. So we need to couple these laws, and the laws itself themselves don't work. So what is about content of Europam? So we analyze legislation on public procurement, and we focus on EU and national guidelines. These are new indicators prepared by DIGIWHIST team. We did it in 2015. We have political finance legislation. Some of the data was taken from the IDEA database that was developed in 2012, but we are updating it yearly, and many countries that were covered by this database were not, so we had to do some of the analysis from scratch. Then we have financial disclosure data that is coming from World Bank's Public Accountability Mechanism initiative. We have conflict of interest restrictions that also is coming from PAM data, and also right to information. And this coming partially from PAM and also from Global RTI Rating, Access Info, and Center for Law and Democracy. So what we did to for data collection to ensure reliability of in-law data, we applied a very systematic approach and created a questionnaire for each mechanism out of these 5 mechanisms, and tried to make them comparable. And we produce also for each country and mechanism a short summary, so that you don't need to go through all the analysis, but you read just 2 paragraphs and you understand, okay, conflict of interest in Germany, this is the legislation, these are the main points, I just need these 2 paragraphs and I'm covered. If I want to go deeper, then I can analyze the entire analysis. And what we have done, we had a very extensive network or experts that were working with us, because we are dealing with very complex legislative instruments here. So we had to have experts from all countries who were in these fields, and in some cases we had to have a really intensive feedback, and I think it worked quite well. We are still we have a system of improving as we go. So just some numbers for each. Just some numbers for each. For each mechanism we have depending on the mechanism, we have different number of indicators. So for financial disclosure, we have around 120 indicators. When it comes to freedom of information, we have only 36 indicators. And each mechanism has also several subcomponents, so starting from 3 when it comes to conflict of interest and up to 5. So this is for each country how we what we're trying to analyze. And I will bring you 2 examples why this is relevant. So this is one of the questions. So is disclosure of final beneficial owners required for placing a bid? We need to find this answer in the law, so we need to analyze them to be able to say, okay, how we are doing with the disclosure of final beneficial owners. And we see only 5 countries where this is the case. And in the rest, in the 30 other countries, this is not the case. So this is something. Another example, which is a bit different, is there a ban on contract signature until arbitration court decision? So in this case, we have a mixed results, and we have many countries, they ban like signing of the contract until court decides, and there are another half countries where this is not the case. So this is also data we can take from Europam. Here we see the quantitative scoring. I will show you briefly quickly the website, how it looks. So you can see the ranking. The more score shows the more comprehensive legislation. But we can see, for example, in case of Denmark, we have 0 score on financial disclosure and score 6 on conflict of interest. That shows that there are no rules in Denmark, but still things are working. So we cannot really say necessarily more laws mean better control of corruption or sector. So it's not so easy. Here is a country profile example. Here we see Germany, and what we can see the change between years. So we can see the score in 2012. also how it is changing in 2015, 16. We are now updating the data and we'll have the 17, and we'll be continuing to doing this for another couple of years. So we can see actually how every year the situation is changing. And here how, like the qualitative data. So we try to make it very simple. Is there a ban on donations from foreign interests to political parties? You have a question, then you have an answer, yes or no. And then there is a comment, and when you click on the I, you can see exactly the source of the law. So it says article so-and-so from this law. And that's how the entire thing is structured. And if you want to read all these laws, they are all presented in a very easy to use way. So you can download all the laws and don't need to go and search for them. So I will just briefly show you how you can also check yourself. So if we want to, this is how the website looks. If we want to look at the political finance, we can see that Greece actually has the most comprehensive legislation when it comes to political finance. This is not surprising because of all the changes that they had to make, that they have so many laws and they have such a comprehensive legislation. We can look at financial disclosure here. We have Serbia. We can look at public procurement. We have Latvia and Serbia. And if we go here, we can, what we created is we created a feedback procedure. So if you find any mistake, you can click on this button and send us an email saying this exactly, this component is wrongly and there is a change or something, and this can be done. So this is briefly Europam. I think I exhausted my 10 minutes. Just a second. Yeah. So we'll be happy to have feedback after.
All right, thank you, Aram. And now the floor is for Mara Mendes, who is DIGIWHIST project lead for our partner Open Knowledge Foundation. Please, Mara, she will present our opentender.eu, our portal. Mara, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, of course, I'm presenting to you a website. You might have waited for it. We talked about all the data already. We talked about indicators. Now you might want to see where to look at them. I would have loved to show you the website live, but unfortunately here inside the European Parliament, it doesn't load as nicely. But if you go to your own computer, some of you are sitting here with their own computers, you might want to browse through the website while I'm showing you some screenshots. Obviously, we had a backup plan, but for the questions later, it might be nice for you to look at the live website now. So, of course, we had some objectives at the beginning of the project. We wanted to create something that is useful to our stakeholders. Of course, we're presenting open data that is already out there, but we wanted to make it more easy for you to browse, easy to visualize data, and to do analytics, to do advanced analytics yourselves, to show some benchmarking functions, of course also to download the data, and to explain to you further what to do with the data. So this is basically when you enter the opentender EU, this is our homepage. And as you see, we have geolocation in there, so you can, the website will ask you whether you want to browse through the German data in that case, because I took the screenshot in Germany, or whether you want to see all available data. That's what you just see above the map. What you can't see there is that we have national languages also available for the national portals, so you can choose between the national languages. They're not all available yet, but they will be during this week, so you can see the, I think we have over 30 languages then or around 30 languages that you can see then. You can see on the map that you can go to the different countries to look at the national data easily through the map or through the countries on the side. So the database is for 33 jurisdictions, which includes the European Commission and all EU countries. I mean, you have heard the countries several times already today. As I said, we have national languages and visualization and an overview of, for instance, the market analysis, administrative capacity indicators. We talked about this earlier, also the transparency and the integrity indicators. If you go to the market analysis, then you will see this. This is a sector overview. As you can see above, there's a date range that you can also change if you like to. So you can create your own visualization. And you can also download the data. You can see that at the very bottom of the visualization, it's very small, but you can download the data even if you change the date range, which means that you cannot only download all the data, but you can also download the data that you have created for yourself, which is kind of nice because that way you can also work with the data on your computer and create your own visualizations. As for the visualizations that change with, for instance, date range, you can take a screenshot and use the visualization if you'd like to. So that way we wanted to make it easier for users to kind of visualize the data that is of interest for them. So this is, as you can see, this is some suggested visualizations, basically, the tenders over time, procedure type, main suppliers and main buyers. And you can see that there's a number of tenders and the volume in euro available, and the average volume as for the tenders over time. And you can click on the different buttons above to have the visualizations accordingly. This is how the indicators look like if you visualize those, and you can again change the date range, and you have a nice visualization for the indicators. You can also sort by the indicators weighting, basically. So this is just a couple of examples of the indicators that you have looked at before. Which is also very nice is that you can basically search for tenders via the indicators. So if you're interested in tenders that scored, for instance, very good, then you can search through the indicators and have the tenders shown accordingly and look at the tenders in more detail. So this is the search function, basically, that we have on the website. And as you can see, 7.7 million tenders here. And you can look at the individual tender here. There are different search options. There's also, if you, for instance, put in the buyer's name, there's suggestion of similar companies, or if similar organizations in that case. And same goes for the supplier name. Which is because, you know, as we talked about it earlier, due to the lack of organizational identifiers, we cannot always pinpoint whether one organization and another are the same, basically. So this is, if you look at one of the tenders, you can see that you can find more information, for instance, through freedom of information requests. If you, for instance, in Germany, we have the FOIA portal that is Frag den Staat. There's a search function to look for FOIA requests that are similar to the tender here. Yeah. So this is basically the download page where you can download in bulk all data or country data. And as I said before, you can also download the data that you have created yourself. Yeah, so this is it briefly from my side. As I said before, I welcome you to look at the page yourself, and then later on we can discuss it in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. And now it's very easy to introduce myself because I have already done that. So for the last part, and very quick, here we go. So this is the third output of DIGIWHIST. It's called MET, Monitoring European Tenders. Also, as a criminologist, we like to think about the Metropolitan Police in London. So, I mean, that's, of course, a bias by criminologists. So that's another tool which is considered to be, let's say, in favor of policymakers or authorities looking to investigate a little bit about which tenders are particular and would need further investigation or understanding. So it is pretty much the same data of opentender, and we aim to develop a tool that enables the users to customize the procurement integrity score, so play a little bit with the indicators and select, download results locally on his own machine so he can mix our results with his own or her own data without any risk, of course, of compromising information, and then go on, of course, with the exploration. This is the interface. Well, unfortunately, we didn't know that the room lighting was this lighting, so we opted for a very dark, criminological-like screen. And basically, you can choose three exploration paths. The first one is going country by country and then dig down to different sub-selection of the tenders. And the second one is searching for actors or directly searching a tender ID that you want to explore in more detail. The one that we'll present mostly today is exploring by country. The idea is to get to the visualization of single tenders with a color scale that where, of course, the redder is the tender which has higher risk scores or integrity or lower integrity as we actually framed it. So this is the look of the website, which is not currently online because this is the last product we will develop in DIGIWHIST, and pretty much everything is set, but we need to fine-tune the last things in this last month of the research project. Basically, on the left, you can pick up a country like we did here. We picked, of course, Italy, and then the very infamous construction sector, which is one of the most interesting for many public authorities. And then we selected the lowest price as the award criteria, and then so on and so forth. You can get to several sub-filters. When you, and then you can reach to a point where you have visualized all these these are tenders, and you can easily look at them. They are ordered, of course, by our procurement integrity index, and you can also select a single tender by visualizing a specific voice. One thing that we aimed at is that the user can interact with our procurement integrity index by manipulating the indicator that compose the index. As you see here, from 0.6, we just remove one indicator, which is unusual decision period. Let's say that our user is not interested in contracts that had unusual decision period. Very well, he can remove it, and the indicator will be adapted accordingly. And then, of course, when you get to one single contract that you think you want to explore a little bit more, you can have a look at the details. This is, of course, let's say the tender informational panel that pops up and shows you that this, for example, this tender had four, I'm sorry, you cannot really see that, but trust me, this tender had four indicators flagged, so he had a score pretty high, above the average, and therefore it can be worth further investigation. And of course, there's a lot of information. The same information that will be available on opentender will be available through, of course, this one. And as I said, you can easily manipulate our procurement integrity index to have the, let's say, the blend that each user prefers to use according to his operational experience. And then all these can be easily exported by a download, and you will immediately have a CSV download so that the file is basically easily accessible through, I don't know, Excel or any spreadsheet editor to further explore. And of course, we will have an exploration by actor. Let's say that we want to search here for a very famous company. Here I typed Siemens, or any other company will pop up that is in our opentender database. And we will see all the contracts awarded to that company. They will be ranked by the procurement integrity index. We will have the opportunity to show a company detail where we will have the average score. So we'll say, how is Siemens faring compared to other players in the same market, for example. And then, of course, we'll be able to look into single tenders pretty much in the way we did before. And then the last one will be, this is really under development, but it will very easily allow everyone to search for a tender, for a piece of words, or for a tender ID that will, let's say that a policymaker just needs to, I want to check whether we have information on that tender. I want to check how does it score on these indicators, and then maybe recollect information for the whole sector in the country. That will be another option available, and will pop up this kind of information for each of our tenders. So that's it for our MET tool. Thank you very much. And we'll now move to the second part of this session, where we have three distinguished speakers that were invited to comment on our tool. So we'll have the first we should have Francesca Recanatini, but she's not reachable, right?
Yes, exactly. So unfortunately, Francesca couldn't be online.
That's
tested,
too bad,
but it doesn't work.
But that's all right. It was probably the Skype call we missed earlier.
Yes, the Skype call we missed. That's
only then or not.
All right, then. So we have other two commentators on our program, and we have Gustavo Piga, professor from the University of Roma, Tor Vergata, who is here, and Dolan, who is over there from Transparency International. You want to sit here? Of course. Welcome. Very well. Please,
I have
Gustavo.
2 more minutes, right, with this? Thank you.
Yeah, you can buy Francesca's time. Ce l'hai qui?
Grazie. 79, desktop. Yeah, this is the one. So thank you so much for inviting me. Delighted to be here. So chapeau to DIGIWHIST. Congratulations. Fantastic results. I don't need to add very much. I just want to add, yes, we can, meaning that if I look back 15 years ago where we were standing with the issue of data in procurement, obviously we are in a completely different world. We've had a revolution. So since we are talking about a revolution, I want to remind everybody and myself that revolution do not come for free, and sometimes they also bring bad aspects with them. Now you might tell me, no, but procurement is not a revolution. Procurement is about tools. Nevertheless, even if you consider them tools, they can have good and bad aspects depending on how you use them. And so I think that it would be quite important that today the debate also enters into an issue of governance, because if you ask me to speak about reform effectiveness, and I add risk management here for failure of those reforms, I think that some things should be discussed. In particular, what I would love to discuss with you is what could go wrong, given this new environment. Well, first of all, we have the issue of frozen data, so maybe nothing is going to change. Is it a likely issue? Well, we've heard today, just to start with the simple stuff, what if there is no handyman? What if we don't invest at the same time in competences? What if the public administration does not start hiring people that know about how to deal with big data? Well, I gather it would be a frozen datum in that sense. But more than that, I believe that we are all discussing with the perspective, well, more data availability will improve society. I come from a perspective which should also be considered, which is I think that data availability is also endogenous to a good society. There's tons of examples. Italy has tons of data on procurement. You gotta ask this data, and sometimes you get a yes, sometimes you get a no. Sometimes the most important research that was ever published in the American Economic Review by 3 gentlemen that you see there got a hold of a huge, large data set by mistake one employee of the Ministry of the Treasury sent an Excel file by mistake, and that created the most important paper that we have so far on public procurement. But sometimes the big database of ANAC is incomplete, and you wonder, why is it incomplete? Where is it incomplete? Is it merely a technological issue, or it is incomplete because we want it incomplete? So I think that the really one key issue we should discuss is how do we make data release and availability more palatable, since sometimes it is not. And I will want to talk about this issue later on. But things can even go, I think, worse if you have this technological revolution. Data can burn you. Let me give just a straightforward example. Imagine a journalist that gets a hold of 2 procurement tenders of the same good, and procurer A buys the item at a lower price than procurer B. Well, what do you expect to see the next day on the first page of the newspaper? How many will blame procurer B? Well, I expect a lot of people to blame procurer B. Now, maybe procurement B is the non-corrupt guy, and procurer A is the guy that did the transaction by agreeing on lower quality. So I worry about that. Civil society, oh, fantastic. Let's talk about civil society. It's well, we have just finished a seminar in Rome where we were shown how social networks use the word corruption. And interestingly enough, when you see corruption on Twitter, when you see corruption on socials, don't expect any analytical analysis, don't expect any investigative approach. It's all partisan. So I'm sorry, when you hear a politician give examples of procurement scandals, ask them, please, if the scandal relates to a party that is opposing the politician that is speaking. And so again, I think that a question that should be raised is, what might prevent us, again, from the wrong use of data? Certainly competence, again, comes in, but then maybe the big skeleton in the closet, should we talk about selectivity in data user and not give it necessarily immediately to everybody, something that I will come later on. So I make one step backward because I want to make a point which is related to what I've said, even though it doesn't look like. What do data in procurement have to do with integrity? I would like to say not that much, or at least I would like to cut the link, the equivalence between these two terms. Again, the study by Bandiera, Valetti, and Pratt, which was an incredible study, was not on integrity. It was related to waste. So data are key for identifying waste. Now, they go on in their paper, which has become very famous, by calculating for this particular country how much % of that waste was due to corruption and how much % of that waste was due to inefficiencies. Data are key in spotting also inefficiencies. By the way, their results, and oops, or something. So I'm talking about a country that you would never expect to generate these results, right? This is Italy. 17% due to corruption, 83% due to inefficiency. Now, why should we worry about this issue of relating all the waste to corruption? Well, there is a framing effect which worries me very much because I love data and because I would love data to be used more. So let me go slowly through it. What are data? Data are tales. With data, you do narrative. You do stories, you do fables. They are powerful. We are here to discuss about this because we know that data have this impact on society when you use them. So, since they are tales, let's remind ourselves of the risks we're running when we tell these tales. First, we know out there's a huge amount of negativity bias. It is easier to remember bad things. I mean, when you go on TripAdvisor and you see one bad quote for a restaurant, that restaurant is killed. If you see a good quote for that restaurant, you want to read if there is another good quote for that restaurant, right? It is there. Confirmation bias exists. I look for what I want to find. So again, connect this with the partisan use, for example, of social networks. And finally, bandwagon effects, which generate lack of trust. These are three things that are there out in society, that are there in fables, that are there in social networks, that we should worry about. Why? Well, simply because one example of corruption might entail the quote-unquote wrong belief that this whole system is corrupt. Now, why do we care about that? We care a lot about that. Because if that belief becomes dominant, then what is generated is lack of trust in procurement. What do we care if there is lack of trust in procurement? Oh, we care a lot. We care a lot because as soon as there is lack of trust, be aware, the lawmaker will do more rules. The procurer will be more risk averse, completely scared of being put in jail, even if he's totally honest. You're not going to see innovation. And you know what? You're not going to see data out there. And this is going to reinforce lack of trust. You see the vicious circle that we're risking of creating. So is there a way in which we can create a virtuous circle that is also based on data that can help data to survive? I don't know. I don't have the slightest idea. So here I have 4 questions for you. But keeping in mind that we have this paradox that as of now we're discussing these issues with a new law, the directive, which had one key revolutionary point compared to 2004. The revolutionary point of 2014, which has not succeeded necessarily in national legislation, was we trust more the procurer. We give more discretionality to the procurer. We know it very well. There's much more discretionality in this last directive than before. So it was all based on trust and accountability in a sense. So why don't we use data management also to create trust with accountability? For example, why don't we start using data to really focus on best practices? A lot. Again, data only. Then another thing that I would like to say, we always mention civil society, and I worry about the incompetence of civil society. We have an actor there that knows a lot, and to which we should talk very much about those data. It's the public administration. Why don't we talk to the public administration about their data and their performance? Because we don't trust them, because we think that data are all about lack of integrity. No, it's about mistakes. So if we really do a directive that is based on trust, we should discuss about data with the public administration. Now, one final issue, benchmarking. Now, there are 2 ways of doing benchmarking. One is across space, and another is across time. To me, personally, as a European, and I add another issue which is related to EU, doing benchmarking across countries seems to me suicidal for the European project. But I close this window. And I just want to say there's plenty of evidence in other countries that when you do benchmarking across one's own organization, these organizations are much more relaxed and willing in using data to improve themselves. So you look at their data, you use them powerfully, and you say, these are my data today, this is where you have to be in 3 years' time. You don't have to worry about trying to convince somebody else that your organization is very different from another organization and the comparison does not fit. No, you are happy. The Philippine example is very interesting in that sense. It's less stressful. It's more rewarding. It gives a lot of incentives. You can relate incentives to improvement within an organization with data. And I believe, I have a suspicion that if we were to move to this type of use of data, then maybe we should see those societies that as of now are kind of scared or maybe slow to release data to provide greater openness and data availability. What does it mean? It's not one datum, we know for sure. There's a negativity bias there, but imagine that you have 12 data on competence. Then maybe people are going to start believing that their own national system is a competent system. This is going to create trust. If you have trust, you have less rules. You have discretion for the procurer. Obviously, you have data, so you have accountability. But that means that you have more discretion, you have more innovation. If you have more innovation, you have less waste. And the government is willing to put more money because it saves on waste. And if you have more money, you pay much more, these fantastic guys called procurers, and they are much less likely to engage in corruption because they would lose a fantastic job. And then you have the virtuous cycle where data are at the center of the whole revolution. So chapeau to you. You are giving to policymakers and procurers a fantastic, and society, a fantastic opportunity. I think now it's also time to start discussing what kind of governance do we want, so that these are flowers that blossom and not flowers that are kept under the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gustavo, for these insightful thoughts and ideas that will likely come back later in the Q&A. And I give the floor to Dolan for his comments to this debate. Please go ahead, Carl.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I have to say, it's been an absolute pleasure to be part of this conference so far. And not only this conference, but also the workshop that took place earlier on in Brussels that many of you attended. It's a pleasure to be around so many clever, dedicated, and indeed competent people looking into this subject matter. And it's been an inspiration to us and Transparency International in Brussels so far. Also, chapeau to DIGIWHIST. I'm not going to, in my remarks, nitpick anything that was presented so far. We and our colleagues in our national chapters around the world look forward to using these tools. It's not my style to nitpick, and I doubt in any case if I have the technical competence to do so. So instead, what I'm going to do is try and provide an alternative perspective on this whole issue, and maybe even a little bit of a counterpoint to what Professor Giga just mentioned as well. So, of course, the whole issue of public procurement has been very central to Transparency International's mission since it was set up incredibly a quarter of a century ago now. That was when we were founded, and indeed one of our first policy prescriptions was this whole idea of an integrity pact. I'm going to come back to this later. An integrity pact is basically a social monitoring tool that is used to see if there is corruption or waste in public procurement. But we applied this more generally in developing countries. First examples of that were in places like India, Indonesia, Mexico, and it's only latterly actually that we've been investigating these kind of corruption risks closer to home on our own doorstep. Around 6 or 7 years ago now, the 24 Transparency International chapters that are based in the EU did an assessment of corruption risks across the board in the EU. And the one thing that kept popping up in every country, in every context was public procurement risk. And so that analysis, which was in fact funded by the European Commission, fed into the European Commission's own analysis and was taken up in its anti-corruption report that it published in 2014, the dearly departed, sadly missed anti-corruption report, RIP, unfortunately. And it has informed that analysis, I hope, a lot of the good work that the European Commission has been doing in this area, in the projects the European Commission funds, but also in public procurement more generally. And let's think about the costs here. There was a study that came out a couple of years ago that was done by RAND Europe that estimated that the cost of corruption, just corruption in public procurement, could cost the EU as much as 5.3 billion per year. Now, these kind of big numbers, I know we're a little bit immune to that. I mean, after many bailouts, bank bailouts, Greek bailouts, etc., of hundreds of billions, maybe 5.3 billion doesn't seem like so much, and it's a bit abstract. So let's focus on something a bit more tangible, corruption in the health sector. So now health services all over Europe are creaking under the strain of being underfunded. We know this again after yet another flu season, just how much our services are struggling to cope. Our national chapter in Slovakia looked at the health sector in particular. They knew from their analysis and work that there was problems in procurement in the health sector. And they calculated that 21% of all healthcare public procurement expenditure could be saved if more competition was introduced into the tenders. And now those savings would allow for a 10% increase in doctors' wages. And maybe, just maybe, that would make those doctors less susceptible to corruption. And in that context, you have to remember that almost 1 Slovak in 3 has reported paying a bribe when coming into contact with doctors and other professionals. So that's really the human face and the human cost of waste and corruption in public procurement. But having talked about the human cost, I want to talk a little bit about the human solution, because we've been talking a lot about data. and tools so far. And the potential of open data. And we too at Transparency International are evangelists about the power of open data. We believe in that. But we shouldn't forget that if there are not many other factors in place, this data can become inert and lifeless. Now, over the last 20 years, there has been a lot of investment in what we might call the hardware of an anti-corruption system. We've been putting in place the legislation, the conventions, the institutions like anti-corruption agencies, or we heard about the European Public Prosecutor earlier. Central data repositories could be considered part of that as well. But I think now is really the time to invest in the software, to invest in the human capital of a successful anti-corruption system. So what do I mean by that? I mean at least two things. So we need to protect civil society, and I think civil society are crucial here, because the data is one thing, but the people who follow up, who harass politicians, follow up with the national authorities, that file complaints to the judiciary, to the ombudsman, to others, who talk to the press, who work with whistleblowers, long after the initial digital exposure, that is, on the whole, civil society organizations. And I want to pause just a little bit and give a brief narrative or fable which could illustrate that. So our colleagues, as you've heard in Transparency International Slovakia, have been looking into the issue of public procurement in the health sector for a long time. They noticed that there was a particular issue in the procurement of very expensive medical equipment, CT machines, MRI scanners, that kind of thing. And as they dug into this a little bit deeper, what they found was that over 2/3 of 27 CT scanners over a 5-year period were purchased without any competition at all, even though there are 4 suppliers in that market. As a result, and they dug a little bit deeper into this and they did the necessary cross-country comparisons, they found out that a Slovak hospital had paid 2.8 million euros for a CT scanner, which a Czech hospital just over the border had paid half as much for. So far so good. That's what the data can tell you. But then, as a civil society organization, not content with that, they dug a little bit deeper, and they found out that the company that had won that bid for that very expensive scanner included on its board as one of its owners a very senior Slovak politician who happened to be the Speaker of the Slovak Parliament. There was a controversy, caused a big fuss in Slovak circles. The Speaker and the Deputy Speaker eventually had to resign. The Minister of Health had to resign. So I think that just shows that in order to make sure that there is that link between the data and the ultimate accountability of the authorities on this, many more things have to happen. And those things happen by civil society organizations taking that information, talking to the press, talking to other civil society organizations, and chasing up with politicians. And we can take that for granted, that civil society will be there to do that. But you will know, many of you will know, that civil society are coming under increasing strain and stress and harassment and legal constraints all over Europe. We've had a Fundamental Rights Agency report that was presented here in Brussels just last week, which detailed, in frightening terms, just the level of restrictions that civil society organizations are facing. So that would be my first point, is that we absolutely do need to invest in the capacities of civil society and make sure that they're around to do their work. The second part, I think, of this, second element of this human infrastructure is providing incentives for whistleblowers and protecting them. This is supposed to be the digital whistleblower, but I would say we still need flesh and blood whistleblowers. And we need them because flesh and blood whistleblowers often provide the standard of legal proof that you need if you're going to get direct accountability, if you're going to get ultimately convictions in this. Because whistleblowers often provide the documentation and not just the sort of indications of risks that you need to secure those convictions. And we have many cases of whistleblowers who have been brave enough to come forward and provide that documentation, provide that evidence. The problem is, when they do so, they face harassment, there's retaliation, there is a victimization. So we also need we need to make sure that there are legal protections for whistleblowers to come forward. There are those incentives to come forward, for them to come forward and to say, okay, if I do this, then I will have the legal protection of the state. So those are just two elements of what I would call the software of a successful anti-corruption system that needs to be in place if any of this is to have any meaning whatsoever. But we are, and I will finish on this point, we are, as I said, evangelists for more data. And I think what we do need is an integrated follow the money data set, which we don't have at the moment. This is the beginnings of it. But two other essential data sets needed to be added to this. First, beneficial ownership data. As illustrated by the Slovak case that I spoke about, having that information about political figures or other people with conflicts of interest who are behind the companies that bid for these tenders, that's absolutely essential. Luckily, we have European Union legislation now which will force all member states to collect beneficial ownership data and centralize that and make it open to the public. I think that's a big breakthrough now for the anti-corruption movement. But I also think there should be legislation that would require authorities to collect that public beneficial ownership information in any public procurement. We know a number of countries do it. Why shouldn't that be the case in all European countries? And maybe that's something for the next round of the public procurement directives. So we need that data. We need open data on who are politically exposed persons that we can match with the beneficial ownership data and match to the procurement data. So my time is up, so I'll end on that. But also, congratulations, and let's set up another workshop for our TI chapters to get their hands dirty with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cara, and let's open the floor after all these two very interesting contributions for question and answers and comments from anyone. Please, who wants to go ahead? Okay, you're very shy, so I have a couple of comments actually on what was said before. I share Gustavo's comments, especially on trust building, maybe because we both come from Italy, and we know that this constant banging on corruption in Italy is very constant. If you look at the media, we cannot say that in Italy people are unaware or the media don't cover corruption. And then as professors, we face the administration and we see the bureaucracy, how entrenched it has become behind rules. And rules that deny any possibility of discretion and pretty much increase the distance between the operators and the reality they should try to regulate and manage. So I think that this is a comment that I wanted to share, and I agree that we should think about a way to recreate trust, and especially some countries where corruption is a very politically debated topic, where corruption is considered to be widespread, or it is perceived to be widespread, are also countries that need an injection of trust. And if we keep banging and banging and banging only with a stick about anti-corruption, that's a problem. Maybe transparency could be a good aspirin, but sometimes we should develop strategies also to improve trust between citizens and the public administration, and within the public administration, because people get just entrenched behind the regulations and they just stick to the regulation. And that's a comment that I wanted to make. Oh, of course. Alina?
If there's nobody else.
There's a question. Please go ahead.
Well, I mean, I would have a few questions, but I will start with a small technical question. In your first example on the MET monitor, you showed Siemens. But the Siemens example you showed was a subsidiary. It was the Siemens Austrian chapter. Now, does in your system this one link to the parent company, and do you attribute all contracts to the eventual end company? I mean, especially in the case of Siemens, I think that's an interesting case, since we all know that many of the cases have been taken up at a higher level within the company.
I would pass the word to Jiří and the others. That's you immediately identified something that gave us so much to work and think about it, because of course, especially with big companies, we have these overlaps, but we tried to solve it in different strategies and different ways. And I don't know, usually do you want to comment on that?
The thing is, we do have the data on the linkages of ownership between various companies. However, these come from private database by Bureau van Dijk, and we cannot publish that. So essentially, we stay with publishing data on individual Siemens chapters. However, if you learn to use opentender, it will typically allow offer you to group companies with similar name, so it can help you do this kind of analysis, grouping various Siemenses together. However, the data published are on the level of individual companies. We did not use the ownership data for that, though we have that available for the research we can do with it, but we cannot publish it.
Okay, then maybe a second, a bit more provocative question. I wanted to thank the professor for his mostly thought-provoking comments. I also found some of them a little bit falling on deaf ears, because if you're talking about problems with public procurement in procurement offices being the result of merely mistakes, I think you're missing some of the points with state capture and some of the examples that were brought to the floor earlier today over direct political clientelism and favoring, you know, your friends in order to sustain their business. I don't think that has anything to do with mistakes. And I mean, if we're talking about the incompetence of civil society, I think it's a welcome challenge. I think we should be very critical of the role of civil society. At the same time, I think, also as Mr. Dolan already outlined, there are not many volunteers who are taking up this kind of work. There's not many people that are happy to risk their reputation, their name, to go out there and challenge some of the decisions, to challenge some of these big procurement contracts. And I mean, in an ideal world, yes, everybody would study this kind of big data, but I think in reality, the world is a little bit less optimistic. It's less happy out there, and there's just very few people competent and willing to do that, and nevertheless, it's important. So I just wanted to remind you of that. And then maybe for civil society as a role, and I think just it's maybe for the DIGIWHIST, do we know exactly what we're after? Because you mentioned that you're scraping the surface and that you're just scanning these wide range of contracts. Now, to what extent does big data and DIGIWHIST offer solutions to look into the subcontracting of the main contracts? I mean, for instance, in the case of Hungary, I know that many contracts are awarded to single bidders, and some companies don't even bother anymore to provide a bid because they simply know which company is going to win, and they also know that that company will furthermore hire their company to take, I don't know, 60–70% of that work. Now, if we don't know the dealings behind these different companies, I mean, you were talking about getting the private sector on board. I mean, it would be interesting, actually, when you talk about Siemens, if you ask them to provide their bids to different contracts, given their history over bribery and the fines they face, it could be a worthwhile investment for them. But the question is really, how can we sort of look behind the surface? Because I still feel that this is like an onion. We peel off the first skin, we see the big contracts, but what's happening underneath? And I mean, I think it's difficult, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts if big data could have any sort of implications on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this very thought-provoking question. And there are two black holes. I mean, you pointed at one of them, and I will remind us of the other one, which is consortia. So when companies jointly bid, right? So our data template, as well as indicators, can accommodate both subcontracting and consortia if the source properly, according to the law, publishes, right? So consortium members and leaders should, you know, reveal their identity. The reality is, in most European systems, is at best you know the name of the consortia, or maybe the leaders, but not the partners of forming the consortia. Same thing with subcontracting. There are strict rules in most countries on what should be reported, and the data is not there. Can we conclude that there is no subcontracting at all? No. I mean, if you see, you know, 3% subcontracting going on in a country, I would just say the people don't care. I mean, that's where simple bureaucratic error and actual wrongdoing and hiding wrongdoing actually go hand in hand, because they just make a small error and then no one can know it. So I think we would very much love to collect more of that data, but it's not there. We can point at it, and I think that's our added value, that, hey, we scratched the surface, there's a lot to see and a lot more, and here is where we should look, but why aren't our laws followed, right? I mean, that's the very question. Why aren't our laws followed?
Well, we got them first, yeah.
I see three people, but
I just wanted to add quickly to this.
quickly one, then Gavin and Carl, okay?
One of the things that we also did in DIGIWHIST was to write a policy recommendation, which is a basic policy recommendation of how public procurement data should be published, but it also includes an implementer's guide with like more detailed recommendations. And you know, it's just like Michi said, basically it's the source that, you know, then causes the problem, which we can only solve by our advocacy work and the recommendations that we can make based on the research that has been done in DIGIWHIST. Unfortunately, of course, we would hope that this, you know, changes over time, and seeing the data aggregated in one place would help to do this.
Thank you, Mara. Go ahead. Gavin, you're there? Yeah, thank you.
Just a couple of comments, if I may, on trust. So just reflecting on, Carl was giving the example of the Slovak Republic, which of course has a contract register. It took civil society to take the government's data and scrape it and make it available openly. When they did that, there was then a measurable increase in competition in the country in terms of bids per tender, right? And it's gross average bid per tender, so it's not a perfect measure, but it basically doubled over time. So it was rendering that data available was very useful for business, which then fed back to increased likelihood to bid, which probably means more trust in the system. With Ukraine and Prozorro, there was an opportunity to measure that from the start. And it's quite clear that actually entrepreneurs have increased and small businesses have increased their trust in the system. You can measure that, and it's measurably proved over time. It's a really interesting dynamic because again, you need civil society to be part of the reforms the government was advancing, in this case TI Ukraine as part of the alliance promoting open contracting, such that people then thought it was probably worth looking at. Once small businesses then bid and won a contract, they told all their friends, and that's the time you get that feedback effect that reinforces trust in the system. So I believe openness, you're right, the dialogue should go way beyond anti-corruption. But I do believe that, if you like, the openness does have a measurable effect on trust. And we published a couple of just pieces talking about that and actually trying to measure that impact. They're not academic articles, I apologize, but they definitely are beginning to explore that. So I think there is something really valuable around trust to be gained from openness.
Absolutely. Carl, please.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I also sympathize with many of Professor Giga's comments. I mean, yes, of course, the language of corruption has become a little bit debased in recent years. So we only need to see the current incumbent in the White House, who ran on a drain the swamp ticket, to see just how debased it's become. I think a Hungarian comedian once, forgive me if I'm wrong, Michi, but a Hungarian comedian once said, corruption is anything that I'm not a part of. And that's what we see in many parts of Europe today. So it's become debased, it's become partisan, that's true, and I think that's a big challenge for the anti-corruption movement as a whole. Yes, of course, I also agree with him that, you know, an important and not to be neglected constituency in all of this is the contracting authorities, the public procurement authorities themselves, and we can work with those. And I would say actually it's an advantage of Transparency International's Integrity Pact model, and if I can remind you, these are pacts between bidders and contracting authorities, which are then monitored by a flesh and blood human being or a civil society organization. In a sense, they're like DIGIWHIST 1.0, I would say. You know, the advantage of that is you do have that engagement with the public authorities and to create trust around these processes. But the problem, of course, is to do that on sufficient scale. And then the other problem, of course, is, apart from scale, is that you know, the world we're living in is that the incentive structure in public administrations is that nothing changes until there's outside pressure. Nothing significant changes until there's outside pressure. We have seen this in so many domains. I'll just give one example, which relates to what I said, which is, you know, everybody was very clear about the poor state of protection for legal protections for whistleblowers in much of Europe, non-existent in Spain for many, many years, any number of OECD reports, TI reports. But it took the Antoine Deltour case and all the publicity around that for the European Commission to come forward and say, okay, we're going to do something about this. And I'm very pleased to see that that the European Commission is on the verge of publishing a proposal for whistleblower protection later this year. So that pressure needs to come. I like to think that pressure can come from the best of civil society, responsible civil society, who are doing the kind of things that DIGIWHIST are doing, the TI chapters are doing, the Open Contracting Partnership are doing. I think the sort of things, frankly nerdy things, that those organizations are doing are far cry from the partisanship and the cut and thrust of corruption allegations that are thrown around most days in the press. So I think we just need to find ways to encourage that and avoid the bandwagon effect.
Thank you very much, Carl. Anyone else? Comments? No? All right, I see a hand over there. Please.
Okay, my speaker is here.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you stand up and maybe speak louder because we can barely hear you? Sorry. Or reach a mic, please. We also have people online that are attending this conference.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Actually, I would like to make a comment. We all agree that data are everywhere, and hence we can find them in public procurement. But big data by themselves are not a solution to a problem. Actually, the most important problem now that automatic information systems and advanced repositories have been established and implemented, the next problem that we have to take into account is data quality that was mentioned in the beginning of the conference. And after we solve this, we should focus on data analytics and business intelligence so as to help us make decisions and make policy making. Actually, fraud detection, anti-corruption systems, etc., will only be implemented by advanced analytics, mathematical statistical techniques, and reporting and visualization. So we should not just stand on the big data and the repositories and how to store data and capture data, but we should move one step ahead. So what I would say is that the next step, and maybe a next conference, should be big data exploitation on help us make policy making and decision making in general, and not just stay in the big data capturing and putting them in a repository. Just this comment.
All right, that's a very ambitious plan for our next conference, but we'll try to keep up. If somebody wants to fund the project, we'll do a conference.
Yes, but big data by themselves do not give any value. I mean, if we have them in a repository and standing there, won't give any value.
I share your view, but actually after 3 years of work and we see the data, and we would like to do like a lot of like big data police or big data analysis, but I think I share the view with Mishi and the others. It's very hard yet because of the point you raised about data quality especially. But anyway, we actually have very last one quick question.
Oh, I just have a comment on this. Sir mentioned that we should do analysis on big data and things like that. But as you mentioned, because of the quality of the data, because of the nature of the data, I think we should also incentivize people who actually can do qualitative analysis, not quantitative analysis, to work with this data, such as journalists, because I mean, data never tell the whole story, right? Data are just the surface, and to really know what the story is, you need to really dig deeper, talk to people, read documents, get to learn the context and so forth.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks to all of you for this very interesting session. Thank you very much again to our speakers and our commentators. And let's move on with the next one. Alina Mungiu-Pippidi, professor at the Hertie School. The floor is yours. Go ahead.
Hello, we're continuing the wonderful tradition of this seminar, which is people have no seats and also no breaks as we move to the last concluding session. Thank you very much for holding up with us. We have a great concluding panel formed with people from the Parliament and the EU institutions, and this is when we finally discuss what do we do with all this data of DIGIWHIST. We also want to discuss what do we do with all the data which is missing from the DIGIWHIST, because despite all the hard work that you have seen, we suffer even more for the data that we missed than on thinking what to do with the data that we gathered. And believe me that the data that we miss is significant. I mean, we were talking this morning about the fact that we should not worry about Sweden. Sweden is doing so well, but I do not know if you noticed, but in the last year, the top of the highest penalties for paying bribes abroad in the world, which is paying bribes on the basis of Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, the American legislation. What company was there? Well, a Swedish company who broke all the records by paying nearly $1 billion in fines for bribing where? In Uzbekistan. So I don't think we, overstretch ourselves going to Armenia and Serbia with this project. I think we should have gone as far as Uzbekistan. And unless we add this to the big DIGIWHIST ensemble of data, we won't really have a good idea, because we should not just judge Sweden by what happens in Sweden. And I think that's a point that Transparency International, for instance, have been making for many, many years. So who should do something with DIGIWHIST data? We're going to hear from institutions in European Parliament. But I just want to say to you something. I mean, what can we do as researchers and who work with journalists and civil society? We will do. In other words, we will provide through our follow-ups projects coaching for journalists, coaching for business associations, coaching for other people who are interested in doing things with this data and do not perhaps find it accessible enough. But even as this data is now, everyone can do what we have already worked in civil society across Eastern Europe. Like the example I will give from my country, I had like 10 years ago these two charts, one showing the big favorite companies who are connected with government, who are having like 80% of all construction procurement market and having profit rates of 40% during the crisis, when in fact the whole construction sector in the country was contracting by 40%. And on the right-hand column, you could see the multinational companies whom we generally suspect that they bribe in corrupt countries such as mine, and they were simply, not winning anything and registering very, very bad records. Now, 10 years later, now I have data. So I have data for 10 years, and I can trace our wonderful indicators over 10 years. I can trace single bidding. I can trace what I call agency capture. In other words, shameless public authorities who give more than 50% of their procurement money to just one contractor. And I can trace political connections simply by putting companies of politicians who donate money to campaigns, or they are in their financial disclosures, together with the data of who win contracts. And what do I get after 10 years, which in my country, which is Romania, I'm not sure I mentioned this, I'm in Germany, but I'm Romanian, so I'm interested in what goes on in Romania, was an unprecedented corruption crackdown. 18 ministers in jail. I don't think anybody else except Brazil in the world is doing so much against corruption. So what happened is that the number of these openly corrupt contracts, what I call particularistic, not corrupt contracts, contracts that you can immediately see that they are given on the basis of a connection and not randomly, went down from 60% to 49%. This is a quarter, and I think actually it's a lot, but, took a lot. But what did not go down? What didn't go down out of these indicators is agency capture. In other words, agencies continued to do the same. Single bidding went down a bit, political connections went down because there was a lot of discussion about politicians winning contracts in the media. Why didn't agency capture go down? Simply because during the 10 years, the government didn't do anything to prevent all this corruption from happening. The government doesn't need to wait until a corruption allocation is made. The government can come and say, oh God, why are you having all these bad results out there? I'm going to replace you. You have to reshuffle your procurement board. You're giving 60% of your contracts to just one company, or, to a company which is connected to a colleague of you in the party or something like this. So I think one important area where we expect things to happen is actually in prevention of corruption, in having a procurement policy. When you act post factum, it's usually too late, and it's really very expensive, and you end up like us 10 years later. And now I hear that multinationals which profited out of our opening of the market are starting being investigated themselves, So in other words, they replace domestic companies, but now they are giving the bribes. So quite a lot of things have to come together on the prevention side, on the repression side, and of course in our business, the civil society and training of journalists and of business people to push a little bit forward. We will actually start with a member of European Parliament, Monica Macovei, because she has to run and vote in about 10-15 minutes. So thank you very much for joining us, and tell us what can European institutions do to take advantage of the 17 million procurement that you can search by country, company, and agency who gave the money.
Thank you, Alina, and hello to everyone. I'm sorry I wasn't here in the first part, but I was in Control Budget, where we again discussed about corruption, organized crime in some countries. It's a great platform, and it's unique from what I know, and it involves a lot of work. So we have 17.5 million of public tenders who are being released on opentender EU today for 2003 to 2017 for selected countries. Now, what can we do with them? Journalists can use and should use them. Mayors, for instance, when they give tenders, ministers when they organize tenders, or they give contracts without tenders. The same for the mayors. Sometimes governments are giving contracts, and I was a Minister of Justice some time ago in the government. I will never forget when we gave contracts without tenders by emergency ordinance, like Executive Act, because the minister didn't want to take the responsibility. So it moved it to a collective body, which is the government. And the first article in the emergency ordinance was, we, the government, accept ourselves from the law on public procurement. Second article, we, the government, give the contract to company A. So I asked, why do we accept ourselves from the law? And the answer was from the Prime Minister at that time, because we can. Now, I'm telling you, I told you this story because Alina referred to prevention of corruption, and that would help mayors, ministers, public authorities to prevent corruption. Yes, for those who want to prevent corruption, because that's a cost of corruption, not the bribe itself, in whichever form it takes. It could be other forms than money. The cost of corruption, in my view, is the difference between the market price of the product, highway, goods, whatever, or services, so between the market price and the real price paid, which is much higher than the market price when it is corruption. Yes, there are indicators, I will not refer to them, we know them, additional acts and so on. And you have them in the study. Now, the problem is, it depends on the countries. So there is no political will in all countries, even in the EU, to prevent corruption and to prevent fake public tenders. So they will not use it. But who will use it? Maybe we have some exceptions, maybe we have some mayors, and journalists definitely will use it. Now, you asked me about the European Union. In the European Union, it's Olaf, who looks at how the European funds are spent, and also the European Public Prosecutor, which is an institution not existing yet, but we hope that at the end of this year it will exist and function, and which is going to investigate in particular the cross-border fraud against European funds. There will be prosecutors from all the member states, and they will look at the most serious cases. Not they will look, they will investigate. And I will say why it was a need to form this, because we saw that the numbers of administrative investigation by Olaf is followed only 10% by the criminal investigations in the member states. So something is wrong. Okay, there is no point to discuss, is Olaf not doing fine, not collecting enough evidence, or the member states, prosecutors or police is not good. The problem is that the system doesn't work. So that's why we created this European Public Prosecutor Office, which will start from the very beginning to the end, and they will send to court the case And they will decide in which court, when we talk about trans-border fraud with European funds, they will decide to which court. And the evidence collected in all the member states in which the crime, the fraud was committed, will be taken into account in the court which will hear the case. So we hope this will work. Of course, everything in order to work depends on people. Otherwise, we create institutions, a lot of them. They consume a lot of money, but they don't work. So we need the proper persons in the proper place. We need brave, courageous people who take the risk and who do it. So this institution, hopefully, they will use it. And also the Commission should use it. Because we also have regulations saying that we prohibit certain companies for coming for tendering if they prove to have done wrong in the past. So you want to know which they are, you have the platform. It's very easy. You don't need to make any research. The research is done. You have the platform. And you prohibit a company from whatever country in the world, including in the EU countries, to participate to the tender. So the Commission also can use it. The journalists and investigative journalists, of course, I don't think I have to argue this. You all know this and you are all convinced of this. And be sure that they will use it. So after Paradise Papers and after Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, we'll have a lot of other papers. The problem is there are so many that at some point the people are overloaded. I mean, only Paradise Papers have over 13 million documents. Yes, I read it. I read them. But I don't know how many people did. But that's why I'm saying staying to the investigative journalists. To me, they are the most, the people to be appreciated the most these days, because they take risk and they reveal things from whichever country and whichever, whoever person, being it the prime minister, president, or so on, and they put them on the paper and they bring them in the open. The problem is to react against it, because there are so many that you realize that it's a network which is very difficult to fight with. It's not only one person here and one person there. But as we need to believe in what we do and not to be discouraged that that it's a network, I do believe that we can also organize ourselves, use the platform, use other means, and fight them. We can't just stay and say, okay, there are too many, the network is all over the world, it covers all the continents, and that's it. Well, unfortunately, it's like this, because many years nothing was done. Many years nothing was done on our side, and but now we know, we have instruments, and we have to act.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for what you're doing against corruption in the European Parliament. And they're a network, but we're also a network, and actually a high-tech network. Some very high-skilled people are seated around this table. Okay, so...
Just one word. We have corruption in member states, but we also have corruption in this institution where we are. I mean, don't imagine that
data is also on DIGIWHIST, on all
it's free of corruption.
But the question really is, I mean, I want to introduce this, and the next speakers, they already know what they want to say, but I just want to introduce this. Monica mentioned, for instance, disbarment of companies. Is this a realistic option? Could we do this? I'm surprised that nobody discusses very much about the fact that we could actually make single bidding more legally restrictive. I mean, right now it's completely legal. I mean, countries can do, or sectors can do, or agencies can actually give all their contracts to one bidder without anything being illegal. Now, if we discover that this is such a, a widespread phenomenon, and if we discover, as we do in our research, that this is actually correlated with corrupt outcomes, should we actually not consider that we may forbid this altogether. I'm just raising this as questions. And let's move to who is like the first at risk out of the European institutions, which is DG REGIO, due to the amount of EU funds which are supposed to, increase cohesion and of course not increase corruption. So we are lucky of having Pascal Boijmans from DG REGIO here. Please.
I'm sorry, I have to leave. I have to vote.
You have to vote. Thank you for joining us.
Another difficult file. So thank you first of all for inviting me, and secondly also I think congratulations to the team who has been working on DIGIWHIST and producing this very impressive database of with very important statistical information, which shows me that with the whole issue of big data, we're only at the beginning of a process of using how to use big data in an intelligent way. This is certainly not the end of a process, but I think it just shows how much we can better use these data. Well, public procurement and regional policy is a kind of a very interlinked marriage, if I can put it like that, since long times. About 50% of the budget being implemented in the member states under cohesion policy, about 50% is being implemented via public procurement. So it's a very important share, and especially in countries where cohesion policy makes about, in some cases, even more than 50–60% of the total investments in public investments. You can see how public procurement can play an important role. On the other hand, it's also, unfortunately, one of the major sources of irregularities in the investments of our programs. When we look at the annual reports from the Court of Auditors, in 2014, almost 50% of the total errors, irregularities, were linked to public procurement. Last year, this went already much more down. So last year it was assessed at 14%, so it fluctuates quite a bit. But it's still one of the major sources of irregularities for the implementation of our funds. On the other hand, it's also fair to say when we speak about irregularities, very often it's automatically translated into the press like corruption and fraud, which is not the case at all. Irregularities means for us mistakes, administrative mistakes made by beneficiaries, and only a small, tiny share is linked to intentional misbehavior. But nevertheless, it has an overall, of course, bad reputation for our funds. So that's why also we together, as structural fund DGs, together with DG GROW, the lead DG in the policy DG on public procurement, and the European Investment Bank, have set up a working group, an internal working group, to see how we could strengthen the administrative capacity in the management of the funds linked to public procurement, and also with the ultimate idea to bring this level of irregularities down. And within that working group, we also see clearly the possibility for the role which open data can play. So it's not only about open data, it's also about training, raising awareness, developing guidance notes, etc. But open data clearly we see as also as an important source of information to bring more transparency in the management of the funds into public procurement and to bring down the level of irregularities. One of your questions in the note you sent to us beforehand was about, well, how are we going to follow up on this? And I think partly we already followed up already in DG REGIO, partly we followed already a bit up to the work of DIGIWHIST. We have been working with Michele Fazekas on until now 2 assignments. One was about, we wanted to see better how, if you could measure in one way or another, how a similar group of contracting authorities, and either we selected transport agencies and municipalities, in member states, how they perform as a kind of a contractor. Do they actually give sufficient trust to potential suppliers to launch, to react to tenders? And that was quite an interesting, I think, interesting study which was revealing, which was based purely on that database, where, for example, for the municipalities, we compared the UK, Poland, Romania, and Sweden. And it was not the expected picture you would expect, the outcome, that only the Swedish municipalities were on top and only the Romanian municipalities were at the bottom. No, it was a much more nuanced picture you got out of this. And certainly we can talk about the methodology, about the data and the incompleteness of the data, but nevertheless it was an interesting exercise to see that it's not always black and white as one would expect. And the second exercise we did with Michali was, and that got quite a lot of attention, was data on public procurement on a much longer time perspective, a much larger database to compare the public procurement performance at regional level. And this fed into the 7th cohesion report, which is a crucial report which we publish every 3 years. The last one was in autumn last year, which gives a kind of an impression of the state of the regions within the European Union. And one of the chapters and one of the graphs which was most read, criticized, and questions asked was about the one on single bidding, the map on single bidding. And I think it was a very interesting and a good example of how public procurement data, coming partly from DIGIWHIST, can really start a debate, because we know that for example, in this map, one of the outcomes was that Poland had a quite relatively high share on single bidding. Poland is at the same time the major beneficiary of our funds. So it led to quite a lot of follow-up questions and debates, not only in Poland, but also in a wider context. So I think it's a good example how open data can incentivize and can start up a debate. In a more general context, what we think, what is good for us for open data, and especially the data from DIGIWHIST, where they can help us. Well, of course, obviously they can help us to understand better certain patterns, to reveal certain patterns which we are not directly aware of. So, for example, the one I just mentioned on single bidding. But it's also important for us, what we also saw, it's important not to take the data as a single standing phenomenon. You need to understand better what is behind. So it's a good starting point to raise awareness, but then that should lead to further in-depth research. And on that base of that research, it can help to design better targeted measures from our side. So for example, should we focus more on preventive measures in the selection of projects, or should we focus much more on measures during the implementation of our funds? Because our auditors find out a lot of irregularities linked to public procurement. For example, extension of contracts without publication, putting addendums to contracts, which of course are breaches of the public procurement legislation. Which you also mentioned in your introduction already, we want to focus much more, we have quite an extensive set already of detecting, discovering measures, correcting measures which are in place. For sure it can always be better, but I think that methodology has already been quite well developed. But we clearly want to make a shift from more corrective, ex-post measures, much more to preventive and proactive measures, and which also moves a bit more into the what Dolan called the soft infrastructure. So which is much more linked to training, much more linked to guidance, transparency, but also, for example, involving civil society. And that we are strong believers in that's also an important part, especially when you want to realize a shift to more preventive measures. So that's also an important element in our policy now, to raise the awareness and to have civil society involved. So for example, we have launched now integrity pacts together with Transparency International, 17 integrity pacts in 11 member states. For sure, this is not going to change the world, but it's clearly it's an important pilot project from which we can learn. And also in these pilot projects, we can see that the importance of data. When you want to activate local citizens via these integrity pacts, then it's important that you can submit clear factual data on the basis of which they can start making their analysis. So I think these are a few lines of thought we are thinking about right now, and also in view of the next program period after 2020. Thank you.
There was some skepticism expressed here earlier in this room that actually following corruption indicators through the European semesters is altogether possible. But I want to suggest that actually it would be, highly interesting, feasible, and revealing. Just imagine that we would have in the European semester one indicator which would be percentage competitive procurement by EU member state. You know, I can tell you that this correlates with everything bad if we know it. However, the problem is that I got a question in the European Parliament the other week at the INTA committee if we could not put this in the trade agreements of the poor, corrupt countries that we trade with. And I would say, yes, it would really be ideal. The problem is that not even after DIGIWHIST, we do not know this figure for all EU28. We probably would be able to answer this for just only about 70% of the countries, which actually brings me to the next question that I want to put on to all the panelists, which is what can we actually do to know more? How can we enlarge from the 17 million contracts to all the contracts in order to be able to answer this question for EU28? So our next speaker is actually from DG Growth and is Mr. Nikita Stampa. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Yes, data, I mean, public procurement is undergoing a huge digital transformation, and data is actually at the core of this transformation, and we hope and we believe that data will transform public procurement. Now, also at the Commission, there has been over the last 3 years, it has been quite spectacular how a merely technical thing that data was. I mean, we have observed that directly in our area of work. Now has become a major policy issue. It was in the single market strategy 3 years ago. Now we have done a communication on public procurement, giving the strategy for the future. And this is one of the 6 priorities, better data for better governance. So for sure, we see all what DIGIWHIST has been doing over the years and what it can still do for the future as a pillar of this work. And we certainly intend to work in close cooperation. I will say more in a minute. Indeed, there is a tension. I think it was clearly expressed today, and I think Gustavo made it very clear. It was very eloquently that there is, on the one hand, it's a critical, wonderful tool for exposing corruption, and that has to be done. It was done. I mean, I have the opportunity to work with Slovakia, and we see how much what Transparency International has done, how much they have exposed the Ministry of Health and other departments, how it has really triggered changes in a way that you can hardly believe that really there has been willingness. People that are now there, at least some of them, really want a real transformation. And that is what now we have to encourage. Building trust is indeed the key. So how do we balance these two? On the one hand, making sure that corruption is exposed. On the one hand, that we use data also to build trust. And also how do we use it to make those institutions more professional? Because indeed professionalism is the key. Also the data provided by Gustavo show it very well. Corruption is not all. Corruption is an issue, but for sure making those the buyers more professional is the key and is one of our major policy responsibility. Now concretely, how do we can we continue to work on data, and in particular with DIGIWHIST? We will continue. A number of our area of work will have an impact on I would say on the upstream, on feeding the database, or feeding all those all the material that is produced there. One very important area we are working on is the contract registers. So we're trying to, I mean, again, the Slovakia was presented as an interesting case, but there are now many countries that have contract registers that can work also as a database and can, if they are produced with according to some standards, like the OCDS, they can provide good quality data, and they can certainly feed all what has been done in the context of DIGIWHIST. That's one critical area upstream. The other one is a bit more technical, working on the forms, on the forms that are used to collect the information for publishing tender in the European context. So we are working on that as well, and we hope that can also have an impact at some stage on quality of data. That's for the upstream. Downstream, our goal is certainly in that spirit of improving governance, of working on improved governance. we will use it to, we will promote all those data with member states. And I can give you a very concrete example. We have been for quite a while now discussing about a report, like we call it a governance report, with the member states, agreeing on a number of indicators that we believe could be of use to steer public procurement policy. And but of course it is difficult to create those reports and see if all the data are there. And we have a technical meeting tomorrow, and Michi will come to show the database and how directly that can help those that have to do this report, how they can use it. So it's a very concrete way of linking, on the one hand, this data and those that are in charge of producing data for better governance. We certainly intend to use this wealth of information for our policy dialogue. We have a number of advanced policy dialogue with a number of countries, together with DG REGIO, in particular those that receive SE fund. And data is certainly something that is extremely useful for assessing what are the issues at stake and so on. And we certainly going to make full use of that. Also, we use on some sectors. I wanted to know, I didn't ask, but if how deep we can go also for sector information with the new database. But to give you an example, data has been for us the way we have engaged the discussion with Germany. Germany has a very serious problem of publication. They have a GDP 4 times as big as Poland, and they publish, I think, what's the exact, I forgot now the exact amount. They produce the same amount with 4 times bigger GDP. Or we also realize that if you look at statistics only, they buy less CT scanners than, I think, a country like Slovenia, which of course doesn't make any sense, which means they don't publish. And that means maybe they simply don't respect public procurement rules, or maybe they do. There are legal issues behind that. But this is a very practical example of what data has a direct impact on the way we drive, we conceive, and we do our policy, and we exchange with member states. I think that is these are the main strand on which we are going to continue working with DIGIWHIST. Of course, the whole aspect of corruption integrity is also critical. They take place, this discussion, in the context of the discussion with the regional policy. On the European semester, actually, we do today use these indicators you are talking about, single bidders, and competitive bidding are certainly indicators that we use for making our assessment of the situation. Unfortunately, as you know, indicators don't tell you all the truth, and it's very difficult to make a policy just on one indicator. Single bidding, of course, may be the results or the caused by corruption, but it may also be the result of the market structure. We simply have, like for Microsoft, you only have one bidder, because there is a market structure that is extremely concentrated. So we cannot, out of indicators, we have to be careful with that, and that was also raised by a number of participants, not to jump into conclusion that may not be true. So certainly we will continue also to use as much as possible those indicators for the fight against corruption.
Thank you very much. Just a word of clarification. By competitive procurement, I didn't actually understand single bidding. What I think matters is the volume of procurement which is tendered versus not tendered. So we should actually have single bidding out of tendered and, tendered out of total. And that would start giving us a little bit of picture of how much really is in competition out there. Our last speaker, but not least, thank you very much, is Jean-François Junger. I pronounced it a bit like Juncker. Pronounce it like Junger, like the German writer, from DG Connect. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. In fact, our DG is the DG that has been financing your project out of the Horizon 2020 budget. I think also being maybe the last one, I will come back to a little bit on some element and fundamental aspects of this corruption and the fighting the corruptions. But before that, I think I want to remind the action plan that was published last year, 2 years ago now in 2016, had at its heart the openness. And we wanted, when we publish it, to have administration to transform the way they work, to be far more transparent, in order to trust, to create the trust. I think administration, if they do not very quickly address this issue of the trust between the citizens and their administration, their government, will lead to all kinds of disruptive situations. And we saw it in the elections in France, for instance. If you follow the debate, being French, I followed it. There was a big question about the trust and the corruption and the gifts that were given to some politicians and so on. And the result of the paper, several of the speakers before talked about the Panama Papers and the other papers that were published, led to the result that citizens had as a reaction to say, they're all corrupted, so let's go for the extreme parties. Anyway, it cannot be worse. Let's go for that, destroy the system, so if eventually we might get something better. And the action plan tried to address this issue by saying, no, we need to be far more open. We need to enable citizens to see what's going on in a transparent way, be able either at least to witness what's going on, but also to participate in the debate, in participating in what's happening in this house, in the European Parliament, or in the national parliament, also at the local level to participate far more. And there are extremely good examples in Europe where we see these participative activities happening. Also participative budgeting, like in many cities now start to have participative budgeting where citizens can decide how much of the budget, where the budget should be spent and for what. So it's pre-procurement because it's how to then the procurement take place. But at least you see an evolution. And Portugal last year even did a participative budget at the national level, which was very interesting, with a very small budget. But it's the beginning of a transformation where you see the people start to participate. And that's where the civil society that is present in the room is so key in order to enable this transformation and this evolution. So your project, DIGIWHIST, was for us a very important, very important project, in particular in view of the call of 2014-2015, where we wanted to address specifically the corruption. It was in the text of the call. And because we know that there we can very quickly demonstrate the benefit. And I think the project has demonstrated the benefit of opening the data, collecting the data, out of which then you can start to do an analysis. I will come back to what can be the next stage at the later stage in what I wanted to say. But so the project, I think, and by organizing also this event in the European Parliament, shows the importance, and working with the colleagues in REGIO and in DIGIWHIST, it's also important. We work with both DGs heavily because the ICT enabled the transformation of things, enable the transparency to take place in a far more effective, and enable then to develop tools that will enable an analysis of all the data, because otherwise, if you have millions of pages to read, you cannot, a human being cannot do a proper analysis. You need IT tools that will enable to do all kinds of analysis. But why is it so important? Because I think this, I haven't heard it during this afternoon discussion, but I think it's important to come back to why it is so important to fight corruption, to fight, let's say, the abuse of the procurement system. So first of all, it's important to enable growth. If you fight it, then you attract more investors. Swedish companies don't need to start to enter into a bribery system in order to win tender. you can participate more. But also, and I think in one of the first presentation, I think it was key, it enables to change the system of legislation that is being done today that create more and more burden in order to try to fight corruptions. And just at the end, there was this idea to say we should ban the single tender, single bidder. But then you can, crooks will very quickly imagine, let's create two companies, they both participate, and one of them win, and we let the other one win after. So very quickly, let's say the crooks have, I think, an imagination faster than administration have. So we need to address it in a different way than purely legislative, and we need to address the values and the culture, the education of the people in order to change this. Another element we are fighting a lot in this transformation of the public sector, and why we're pushing for that, it's because we believe very strongly that if you are able to modify the way administrations are working, behaving, you change the society profoundly. And this change will spill far beyond purely the relationship between the citizens and the administration, but it will also spill onto the private sector. And there I'm going a little bit beyond this project and what's going on in the subject of today, but we're working also on the introduction of the once only principle in another regulation, in the single digital gateway regulation. The reason we're pushing to simplify administrative burden, to simplify things, how do we want to do it? We want to make sure that administration will be handling personal data in the best possible way, most transparent way for the citizens, enabling citizens to decide whether their data, personal data, are being reused, so that when they start to work on Facebook, with Google, they start to think, oh, but wait, with the administration I can do this, I can control the data, I can refuse that my data are being reused, that is used purely for my benefit and not against me, and then they will start to demand. So within that context, within the transformation and the action plan, we believe that administration need to lead by example in anything they're doing, and in particular in the way they're using the technology. Technology enabled to change everything, but we need to do it in the best possible way. The last point I wanted to raise about the need to rebuild the trust is what I said at the beginning of when I spoke, is the democracy. I think corruption, and we see in many member states, but also outside member states, people are more and more aware of the issue of corruption and want to fight it. And if we don't fight it properly, that democracy might be at threat. I think in this house, and we saw with the speakers before, I think it's really important that politicians realize that they need to lead, they need to take the issue very seriously, otherwise more papers will come out, more things will come in the newspaper, which is good, but then it undermines the democracy, because citizens will say there is a problem, they will generalize it very quickly, and that will then put the full democracy at risk. And I think there we need to continue to provide the information, and that's where the project is useful to provide the data. Now, what can we do, and what can we do beyond this project? And coming back to the question that was raised earlier, I think in the, again, Horizon 2020 program, we have called this year, but it was also in previous call, but I think it might be extremely relevant now, is indeed big data is happening. Data start to be there of more or less good quality. What is missing are the tools to enable crunching all the data and to be able to do a full analysis of the data. And so we're calling in Horizon 2020 for a project to provide the tools and then give the tools to the public administrations, to the civil society, using the cloud initiative that was published at the same time than the government document back in 2016, so that the complexity of the data can be addressed and the link in particular, the cross-link between multiple database, multiple sources can be done in an effective way in order to start to understand that is a single bidder really a corruption? If it's Microsoft, okay, then you can argue the monopoly situation of Microsoft, but that's a different issue. But can we start to help the civil society and the citizens to pinpoint faster to the issue, to provide a tool to journalists to be able to do a widen analysis and then to publish and to really have. And I think, and I saw it in many other cases, I think it's, as I said it earlier, I think it's important that things appears in the newspaper so that those who want to cheat will start to be more scared and will so maybe develop more sophisticated ways of trying to avoid. But we need to raise, we need to really raise the level of awareness and the level of demands from the citizens so that then the politician will start to behave in a better way, and hopefully we can address it in a better way. Then I would say then we could go on to more fundamental issues of the society, but we'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for this wonderful, insightful, and well-thought remarks. Just a word of, alleviation for people who are concerned that crooks are becoming more and more refined and nasty. Well, they are, but also transparency is bringing quite an extraordinary increased costs to crooks. And I'll just give this example again from my country. This gentleman who was so strong that in fact they had a whole parliamentary committee who was supposed to regulate finance working for him. And one day when country grew stronger and they started to go after him, he knew they were coming after him. So what did he do? He took all his financial empire and divided it in half. Half went for his wife and another half went for his lawyer, for the moment when he's going to be arrested, to be able to say, well, but there's nothing you can take from me. And you know what happened next? The wife and the lawyer, of course, got together and left for the Caribbean, and this guy is still in jail today. So we are increasing their cost, and this is our DIGIWHIST. Also, thank you for this. It was a wonderful expression. Our DIGIWHIST is to have everything digitalized out there so that people can, compare costs across Europe and to really, be able to exercise accountability before any corrupt acts take place. We're not, in business in going after corruption. Thank you very much for this great panel. This is the concluding panel, so we have no Q&A. Also, I'd like to thank a lot for the European Member of Parliament for Hungary, Benedek Javor, for organizing all this. And to the great organization teams, David and his staff, Geraldine, and everyone from Hertie School and from Cambridge who put this together. Anything else I should say? Well, why don't you do that?
The one last point, that our generous hosts have a parliamentary briefing on free flow of non-personal data in the EU, and you can take copies if you want. And thank you very much. You've been a great audience.
And you know where to find us for further questions.